In turn, these perceptions of intergroup competition will lead toward greater hostility toward the minority group. Early research in Britain produced mixed findings relating to these theories. Some of the most interesting early findings came from the 1966 survey of race relations. In particular, analysis of a question that asked white respondents if they had contact with a non-white immigrant produced mixed support for the contact hypothesis. Whites who reported contact with West Indian immigrants, by and large, said that that experience left them with more favorable attitudes towards West Indians as a group. By contrast, whites who reported contact with Pakistanis, again, overwhelmingly reported that that experience left them with more negative attitudes towards Pakistanis as a group. Another analysis of the survey found that whites who lived in close proximity to non-white immigrants displayed less racial prejudice than did other whites. Again, a result that was consistent with the contact hypothesis. Some later studies, though, would suggest that the relationship between the spatial concentration of minority group members and whites' prejudice was not linear. In particular, some studies found that whites living in very close proximity to a non-white family were less prejudiced than whites living in nearby neighborhoods that were not ethnically diverse. But this latter group, living in a city with a large immigrant population, but not necessarily near those immigrants, this latter group was also found to be more prejudiced than whites living in areas with no immigrant population whatsoever. Of course, our major methodological problem here in unraveling the effects of racial and ethnic context on racial attitudes is establishing any sort of causal order between the variables. Right? Using a measure of self-reported contact as an independent variable is problematic in that racists are likely to simply avoid any unnecessary contact with minority group members. By the same token, using the ethnic composition of an individual's neighborhood or city as an indirect measure of either contact or threat is vulnerable to a similar criticism insofar as individuals will choose to reside in a neighborhood that reflects their preferences for racial diversity or lack thereof. Dustman and Preston tried to overcome this problem in their analysis and question from the British Social Attitudes Survey relating to racial prejudice. Specifically, they employ a simultaneous equations model, which allows the ethnic composition of an individual's neighborhood to be endogenous to the racial prejudice, but assumes that the racial composition of an individual's county will be exogenous. Their model indicates that higher concentration of ethnic minorities at the local level does lead to more negative attitudes towards minorities. However, one problem with their analysis is that it doesn't distinguish between the various non-white minority groups. I took up this particular problem in my dissertation research, analyzing questions from the British Social Attitudes Survey and the British Election Study from 1996 to 2001. My analyses do indicate that whites' racial hostility is affected by their local ethnic context. However, I found that the direction of this effect depended on which ethnic minority groups resided in the area. So consistent with the contact hypothesis, whites who live in neighborhoods with relatively large black population are less likely to express negative attitudes towards immigrants or ethnic minorities than whites who have few black neighbors. By contrast, whites living in areas with relatively large Pakistani and Bangladeshi populations were more likely to have more negative attitudes towards ethnic minority, more in line with racial threat theory. So it seems that proximity towards the more socially integrated group has a different effect than does proximity to the less integrated group. These differential effects persist even after controlling for individual levels and other contextual factors such as housing conditions, labor market conditions. I also provide some evidence for the proposition that both of these dynamics, contact and threat, are operating simultaneously, but at different geographic levels. At larger geographic levels, the predictions of racial threat theory tend to be confirmed. However, at more intimate geographic levels, such as neighborhood, the contact hypothesis tends to be supported. So I'm running low on time here, so I want to suggest a couple of things of ways that future research might proceed. Particular qualitative research, I think one thing that we need to do more of is establish the precise causal mechanism by which ethnic context affects attitudes. Qualitative research shows that whites' resentment tends to stem from two beliefs. One, a belief that minority group members are not doing enough to integrate themselves into British society. That's a finding that's perhaps consistent with my research. But a second source of resentment is that members of minority groups are being given privileged status with relation to the provision of public services, housing in particular. Just briefly show you a finding from the 2007 citizenship survey, which shows that nearly a quarter of whites think that they would be treated worse than members of other races than, so whites are more likely to expect discrimination here than are members of racial minority groups. Dan Hopkins, I'll just gloss over this. Dan Hopkins in a working paper shows that the effects of local context also depend on the national political climate. It looks before and after the 2005 election, where the conservatives emphasized immigration. He finds that after the election, the ethnic composition of an individual's neighborhood has an effect on their attitudes, but not before, when immigration was not being given a lot of attention in the media. But again, some very quick points for future research. First of all, I'd say that we should not consider the ethnic identities and attitudes of whites and ethnic minorities in isolation from one another. Instead, it seems to be some sort of dialectic process here at work between members of these different groups. The second general suggestion is that members of distinct ethnic minority groups should not be aggregated into a monolithic non-white category. Members of these groups think of their ethnic identification in different ways. Whites seem to have different reactions to the spatial concentration of these different groups. This creates a lot of methodological problems, but we need to have measurement of identity that is more fluid, and reflects the complexity of group boundaries. And finally, as I was just talking about, what we really need to do is focus on the precise causal sequence by which these geographic variables, like ethnic context, affect people's identities, attitudes, and behavior. So thank you.